The morning sun filtered through the autumn trees, casting golden light across my back porch as I sipped coffee and watched a family of deer grazing at the edge of my property. 6 of them today. The doe and her 2 fawns had become regular visitors, along with what I assumed was last year's offspring. They moved gracefully between the trees, occasionally stopping to look in my direction before continuing their breakfast. This view was exactly why I had purchased this home 4 months ago. After 15 years in the city, I had finally saved enough for my dream property. 3 acres backing directly onto hundreds of acres of woodland with established hiking trails. Close enough to town for convenience, but far enough out to feel like I was truly in nature. Perfect for someone like me who had grown up hunting with my father and grandfather in these very woods. I took another sip of coffee and smiled. My real estate agent had found me a gem. The listing had emphasized privacy, nature access, and the ability to enjoy outdoor activities right from your back door. The property lines extended 50 yards into the woods behind the house, giving me my own private access to the trail system that wound through the forest beyond. The neighborhood itself was a pleasant surprise. The houses were spaced far enough apart to maintain privacy while still feeling like a community. My neighbors to the left were an older couple who brought over a homemade pie when I moved in. To the right was a young family whose kids occasionally rode their bikes past my driveway, always waving politely. It seemed I had found the perfect balance between wilderness and civilization. I remember the moment I first noticed the small, Whispering Pines community sign near the entrance to our road. It was tasteful, made of natural wood with carved lettering. Nothing like the gaudy entrance monuments to the luxury developments closer to town. I had not thought much about it at the time. Rural communities often named themselves, but rarely had formal management. The welcome package arrived 3 weeks after I moved in. A folder with a tree logo contained community guidelines, contact information for various services, and a welcome letter signed by Patricia Henderson, president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. I flipped through it casually, noting recommendations about trash collection days and community events. Nothing seemed particularly restrictive or concerning. The final page mentioned monthly dues of just $75, which seemed reasonable for road maintenance, and the community center I had noticed during my initial property tour. That first month passed peacefully. I finished unpacking, installed new shelving in the garage for my hunting equipment, and began exploring the trail system behind my house. I met more neighbors on these walks, all of whom seemed friendly and welcoming. Several mentioned how glad they were to have someone move in who appreciated the natural setting. No one mentioned anything about hunting restrictions. It was Mrs. Edwards, the elderly woman next door, who first told me about the deer problem. She stood at our property line one evening, looking forlornly at her devastated garden. "Third time this week they have destroyed my vegetables," she said, gesturing to the trampled plants. "Been getting worse every year. The development pushed them out of their natural feeding grounds, and now there are too many for the forest to support." I nodded sympathetically. I noticed there seemed to be quite a few around. "Too many," she confirmed. 3 car accidents last month alone on Route 16. Poor animals. Poor drivers, too. One was seriously injured when a buck came through his windshield. She shook her head sadly. Used to be hunters kept the population in check. That was before Patricia and her board started changing rules. That was my first hint that something was not quite right in my rural paradise. The next day, the monthly HOA newsletter arrived in my mailbox. A small article on page 2 caught my attention. Wildlife management concerns. The board continues to monitor the growing wildlife interface issues. residents are reminded that management of wildlife is the exclusive domain of the HOA Environmental Committee. I did not know then how those innocent-sounding words would soon turn my peaceful new life upside down. November brought perfect hunting conditions. The deer season had officially opened, and I had spent weeks preparing. My hunting license was current, I had the proper tags for the county, and I had carefully studied the state hunting regulations. I planned to hunt only on my own property, well within my legal rights according to county ordinances. I set up my blind at the back edge of my land, with a clear shooting lane that ensured any shot would travel safely into the hillside beyond. The first hunt was successful. I took a mature buck at dawn, field-dressed it properly, and had it processed by a local butcher who would donate half the meat to the county food bank. This was ethical, sustainable hunting at its best. I even took photographs for the wildlife management report I voluntarily submitted to the county conservation office. 3 days later, a certified letter arrived bearing the Whispering Pines HOA logo. I opened it at my kitchen table, expecting perhaps a community announcement or dues statement. Instead, I found myself staring at an official cease and desist notice with the words "violation" stamped in bold red letters across the top. This letter serves as official notification that you are in violation of Whispering Pines HOA Covenant Section 12(4), be prohibiting hunting, discharge of firearms, and wildlife harvesting within community boundaries. A fine of $500 has been assessed to your account. Continued violations will result in escalating penalties up to and including property liens and legal action. I read the letter 3 times, unable to believe what I was seeing. My hands trembled slightly as I set it down and pulled out my property documents. Nothing in my closing paperwork had mentioned hunting restrictions. I reviewed the HOA welcome package again, finding only vague references to wildlife management protocols. The next day, I pulled the complete HOA covenant documents from the county recorder website. There it was, buried deep in subsection 12(4)b. No hunting, trapping, or discharge of firearms or projectile weapons is permitted within community boundaries, regardless of state or county permissions. This made no sense. The county explicitly allowed hunting on private property of this size. More importantly, controlling the deer population was a recognized necessity for both conservation and public safety. I immediately called the HOA office and requested to be added to the next board meeting agenda. The Whispering Pines Community Center was a small but well-maintained building near the front of the subdivision. When I arrived for the meeting, 15 or so residents were already seated in folding chairs. At the front, 4 people sat behind a table with name placards. The center position was occupied by a woman in her 50s with immaculately styled blonde hair and a cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than my first car. Patricia Henderson, read her placard, the HOA president. When my agenda item came up, I approached the podium with my documentation in hand. I kept my tone reasonable and my points clear. Good evening. I am here to discuss the hunting restriction violation I recently received. I have carefully reviewed county regulations which explicitly permit hunting on private property of 3 acres or more. Additionally, the deer overpopulation is causing garden damage and creating dangerous driving conditions. Controlled hunting is the most effective management solution according to state wildlife officials. I placed my hunting license and county permits on the table before continuing. Everything I did was legal, ethical, and followed strict safety protocols. I respectfully request the board reconsider this restriction in light of the conservation and safety benefits of controlled hunting. The room was silent for a moment before Patricia Henderson spoke, her voice carrying a practiced pleasantness that did not reach her eyes. Thank you for your perspective. However, the rules are quite clear. We simply cannot have people firing weapons in our community. It presents an unacceptable safety risk to our residents. But the county regulations specifically allow, I began. County regulations are minimum standards, she interrupted, her smile tightening. Our covenant establishes additional protections for our community. The HOA has exclusive authority on this matter. One of the other board members, an older gentleman, leaned forward. What about the deer problem? We have had several complaints about garden damage and those accidents on Route 16. Patricia waved his concern away. The Environmental Committee is developing a management plan that does not involve violent solutions, perhaps contraceptives or relocation. I tried again. Those methods have been proven ineffective and prohibitively expensive for populations this size. The state wildlife management. The decision is final, Patricia cut me off sharply. Your fine stands. Further violations will result in escalating penalties. She shuffled her papers. Next agenda item, please. As I walked to my truck after the meeting, I noticed Patricia watching me through the community center window, her cell phone pressed to her ear. Her eyes followed me coldly as I drove away. Something in her expression told me this was far from over. This was not about deer or safety protocols. I had somehow made myself a target. The next morning, an SUV with the HOA logo drove slowly past my house. The driver pointedly photographed my property before continuing down the road. The battle lines had been drawn. Over the next 6 weeks, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Every 3 days, like clockwork, the HOA inspection vehicle would drive by my property, sometimes passing multiple times in a single day. Each pass resulted in new violation notices. My hunter orange vest hanging in the garage window, $250 fine for improper storage of hunting equipment visible from community property. A deer feed block inside my property line, $500 for wildlife baiting in violation of community standards. My truck parked in my own driveway with hunting equipment locked inside, $350 for storage of prohibited equipment in community view. The fines accumulated with alarming speed. By mid-December, I had received over $2,500 in penalties, each notice bearing Patricia Henderson's signature. I attempted to attend another HOA meeting to protest, only to discover the date had been changed without notification to accommodate holiday schedules. When I emailed the board secretary requesting clarification of these violations, the response was a terse reference to the covenant subsections and a reminder that continued noncompliance would result in additional penalties. Sleep became a luxury I could no longer afford. My dining room table disappeared under stacks of documents, property deeds, county maps, wildlife management reports, and the growing pile of HOA violation notices. I spent my evenings researching property law and HOA regulations, looking for anything that might help me fight back against what was clearly becoming personal harassment. On a particularly cold morning in early January, I watched from my kitchen window as the HOA vehicle made its third pass of the day. The driver slowed to a crawl in front of my house, camera aimed at my property. My blood pressure spiked as I spotted Patricia Henderson herself in the passenger seat, pointing toward my front door. Something inside me snapped. I needed help from someone who understood the system. The county record's office was housed in a worn brick building downtown. The woman at the front desk, whose nameplate identified her as Margaret, looked up as I approached with my property documents. "How can I help you today?" she asked pleasantly. "I need to research the original property boundaries and easements for Whispering Pines development," I explained. "Specifically, the history of the land before the HOA was established." Margaret studied me for a moment. "HOA troubles." I nodded wearily. "You are not the first from your neighborhood," she said, her voice lowered. "Let me see what I can find." She disappeared into a back room and returned 20 minutes later with a large folder. "These are the original survey maps and land grant documents from before the development was built," she explained. "Most people never look at these, but they might contain information about grandfathered usage rights and easements." As I thumbed through the folder, Margaret placed a dusty book on the counter. "You might find this particularly interesting," she whispered, pointing to a bookmarked page. "This contains the original land usage rights from when this area was first established in 1892. Before you go, take my card. If you need certified copies of anything, just call me directly." That night, I spread the documents across my living room floor. The development had been built on what was once a large hunting preserve, established by a land grant that specifically protected hunting rights in perpetuity. More importantly, the hiking trails that wound through the community were actually designated as public easements, with usage rights that predated the HOA by over a century. According to the original land survey, these easements retained their historical usage permissions regardless of subsequent development. I pulled out the community map from my welcome package and compared it to the historical documents. The revelation hit me like a thunderbolt. The HOA had no legal authority over these trails at all. They were technically public land with protected historical usage rights. My phone rang just as I was processing this discovery. The caller ID showed a local number I did not recognize. "Hello," I answered cautiously. "This is Robert Jenkins from Oak Ridge Drive," a man's voice said. "We have not met, but Margaret at the county office suggested I call you. I understand you are having some issues with the HOA." "You could say that," I replied. "Join the club," Robert said grimly. "I got fined last month for installing solar panels, even though state law explicitly prohibits HOAs from blocking renewable energy installations." We talked for nearly an hour. Robert was not the only one. He connected me with 5 other homeowners, each with their own story of HOA overreach. Patricia had apparently been running the association like a personal fiefdom, selectively enforcing rules against residents she disliked while ignoring violations from her friends and allies. "She used to be on the city council," explained Linda Forrest, another homeowner who called me later that evening. "She lost her last election after some controversy about development contracts. The HOA is her new power base. Anyone who challenges her ends up with endless violations." By midnight, a plan was beginning to form in my mind. The historical documents, the easements, the protected hunting rights, the coalition of frustrated homeowners. All pieces of a puzzle that were starting to fit together. If Patricia wanted a fight, I would give her one, but not the one she was expecting. The next morning, I made an appointment with an attorney who specialized in property rights and HOA disputes. It was time to turn this personal vendetta into a legal checkmate. The offices of Harrington and Associates occupied a modest building near the courthouse. Sarah Harrington, a sharp-eyed attorney in her 40s, listened attentively as I laid out my situation, occasionally nodding or making notes. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. "May I see those historical documents?" I passed her the folder from the county records office. She examined each page methodically, her expression shifting from professional interest to surprised amusement. "This is quite something," she finally said, tapping a yellowed section of the original land grant. "This paragraph here explicitly states that the land comprising what are now your community trails was granted with permanent hunting rights that cannot be revoked by subsequent organizations." She flipped to another document, and according to this, those rights were never properly transferred or nullified when the development was built. The easements maintain their original usage permissions. "So the HOA has no authority to prohibit hunting on those trails?" I asked. "Not only that," Sarah replied, "but according to these easement agreements, the land was designated for wildlife management purposes. Hunting was specifically protected as a conservation method." She looked up at me. "Your HOA is actually in violation of the original land covenants by preventing appropriate wildlife management activities." My heartbeat quickened. "Can we use this?" "Oh, absolutely," she said with a confident smile. "But we need to be strategic. First, we document everything. Every interaction, every fine, every form of harassment. Second, we map the precise boundaries of these easements to confirm their current location. And third, we prepare to file formal notice with the county enforcing your historical usage rights." The following weekend, I walked the community trails with a high-precision GPS device, carefully mapping boundaries and comparing them to the historical surveys. Everything matched. The trails that wound through our development were indeed the protected easements from the original land grant. As I completed my survey, I spotted Patricia Henderson giving what appeared to be an impassioned speech to a small group of residents near the community center. Through my camera's zoom lens, I could see her gesturing animatedly, occasionally pointing in the direction of my home. She was clearly rallying support against the dangerous elements in their neighborhood. When I returned home that afternoon, a new certified letter waited in my mailbox. This was not just another fine notice. It was an official notification of property lien proceedings. The HOA was claiming I now owed over $12,000 in accumulated fines and penalties. Without payment within 30 days, they would file a lien against my property, potentially forcing a sale to recover the alleged debt. Most homeowners would panic. Instead, I calmly added this letter to my growing evidence folder. Patricia had just made her most aggressive move, believing it would force me to back down. She had no idea she had just handed me the perfect justification for what was coming next. That night, I opened a new document on my computer and typed a title at the top: Reclamation Plan, Enforcing Historical Land Usage Rights. Below it, I outlined a comprehensive strategy that would use the HOA's own aggressive tactics against them. I sent the plan to Sarah Harrington for legal review, then reached out to my growing network of fellow homeowners who had suffered under Patricia's reign. Many had skills that would prove invaluable. Robert Jenkins had experience in local government. Linda Forrest was a retired environmental science teacher with connections to the state wildlife department. Another neighbor, Dave Simmons, worked for the local newspaper. Sarah called the next morning. "I have reviewed your plan," she said. "It is not only legal but beautifully constructed. The HOA has no idea what is coming." "Do I have your approval to proceed?" I asked. "With one addition," she replied. "I want to formally request all HOA financial records for the past 5 years. Something about this aggressive enforcement feels suspicious. I want to see where the money from all these fines is actually going." I agreed immediately. Sarah said she would file the request that afternoon and prepare the necessary legal notifications to the county about the enforcement of historical land usage rights. As I hung up the phone, I felt a strange calm settle over me. For weeks, I had been reacting to Patricia's attacks, always on the defensive. Now the tables were about to turn. The wheels of justice had begun turning, but not in the direction the HOA expected. I opened my garage and pulled out the supplies I had ordered: heavy-duty aluminum signs, wooden posts, and a commercial-grade hammer drill. It was time to reclaim what was rightfully protected by law. Dawn painted the sky in shades of purple and orange as I hammered the last sign into place. Notice: Wildlife Management Area, Seasonal Hunting Zone Est 1892. The metal glinted in the early morning light, positioned at precisely the legally required height and distance from the trail entrance. I stepped back to examine my work, then consulted my map. 26 signs now marked the boundaries of the historical easements, each placed in perfect compliance with county regulations for designated hunting areas. Every detail had been meticulously planned. I had filed all the necessary paperwork with the County Wildlife Management Office 3 days earlier. The hunting zone declarations were officially recorded in the county system. The safety perimeters exceeded minimum requirements by 50%. Warning signs were placed at exactly the intervals specified by state law. Everything was documented with photographs, GPS coordinates, and witness statements from 2 fellow homeowners who had accompanied me on different sections of the installation. By 8:00 a.m., I was seated in the office of Carol Reynolds, the County Wildlife Management Director. She reviewed my conservation plan with professional interest, occasionally nodding as she turned the pages. "This is impressively thorough," she said, reaching the final section. "The population control metrics are exactly in line with our recommendations. Your safety protocols exceed our requirements, and these historical documents clearly establish the legal basis for the hunting zone designation." She reached for her stamp and pressed it firmly onto the approval page. "This is exactly what the deer population needs in that area. We have documented a 40% increase in deer vehicle collisions in that sector over the past 3 years." "Thank you," I replied, accepting the stamped documents. "Will you be notifying the local authorities about the newly designated zones?" "Already done," Carol confirmed. "The sheriff's department has been updated on the boundaries and seasonal hunting windows. They will enforce the state prohibitions against tampering with wildlife management notifications or interference with approved conservation activities." That afternoon, I met with my growing coalition of homeowners at a local restaurant. Maps spread across the tables showed the extensive network of trails that legally qualified under the original land grant. Robert Jenkins had brought his brother-in-law, a retired judge who volunteered additional legal perspective. Linda Forrest had prepared documentation on the environmental impact of deer overpopulation, including garden destruction, increased tick-borne diseases, and vehicle collisions. "This is not just about hunting rights," I explained to the group. "This is about restoring proper management to land that has been mismanaged by an overreaching HOA board. This is about community safety and environmental responsibility." "And about putting Patricia in her place," added Robert with a grin. "That is just a beneficial side effect," I replied, unable to suppress a smile of my own. We discussed the likely HOA response and prepared countermeasures for each scenario. Sarah Harrington had provided a detailed legal brief outlining our position and the potential liabilities the HOA would face if they attempted to interfere with legally established wildlife management areas. Dave Simmons had prepared a press release for the local paper about the new conservation initiative, carefully framed as a positive community development rather than a confrontation. As we concluded our meeting, Linda pulled me aside. "You know Patricia will not take this lying down," she warned. "She has built her whole identity around controlling this community." "I am counting on it," I replied. "In fact, I have prepared for her specific reaction." I showed Linda my phone screen, displaying the feed from 4 wireless cameras I had hidden near the most prominent signs. Each was motion-activated and uploaded directly to cloud storage. If she tampers with legally posted wildlife management notices, that is a violation of state law. Linda raised her eyebrows. "You think she will take the bait?" "I do not think," I replied. "I know." I did not have to wait long. At 5:17 p.m., my phone began buzzing with notifications. The motion sensors had been triggered at the main trail entrance nearest to Patricia's home. I opened the live feed to see her luxury SUV parked on the shoulder. Patricia herself stood before one of my signs, her face contorted with rage as she read the official notice. She looked around quickly, then grabbed the edge of the sign and began tugging at it. The heavy-duty bolts I had used resisted her efforts. She returned to her vehicle and came back with a pair of gardening gloves and a pry bar. For several minutes, she struggled with the sign while my camera recorded every second. Finally, with one powerful yank, she managed to tear it partially from its post. The sign dangled precariously by a single bolt as Patricia tossed the pry bar into her SUV and drove away with a screech of tires. I immediately sent the video to Sarah Harrington, who replied within minutes. "Got it. Clear violation of Code 42.315. Keep recording." By evening, my phone was exploding with text messages. News of the signs had spread throughout the community. Some residents were confused, others concerned, many supportive once they understood the legal basis and safety protocols. The HOA message board lit up with discussions, most notably absent of any official response from the board itself. That changed at 9:37 p.m. when an emergency community notice email arrived from the HOA account. It announced an emergency board meeting scheduled for the following evening to address illegal hunting zone designations and safety concerns. All residents were strongly encouraged to attend. The notice concluded with a personal message from Patricia Henderson. "Rest assured that your HOA board is taking immediate action against this dangerous and unauthorized activity. We have contacted our attorneys and will protect our community from this reckless behavior." I forwarded the email to Sarah, who responded with a single word: "Perfect." Before going to bed, I checked the cameras one more time. 2 more signs had been tampered with, one completely removed. All on video, all illegal under state law, all exactly as I had anticipated. I slept better that night than I had in months. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation, but for the first time since this ordeal began, I would enter the battle with the full force of the law behind me. The HOA had walked directly into a trap of their own making. The community center had never been so crowded. Residents stood along the walls after all available chairs were filled. The air hummed with tension and whispered conversations. At the front, the HOA board members huddled with a man in an expensive suit who I assumed was their attorney. Patricia paced behind the table, her face tightly composed but unable to hide the tension in her movements. I sat quietly in the second row, a leather portfolio containing all my documentation resting on my lap. Sarah Harrington sat beside me, her professional demeanor projecting calm confidence. Behind us were Robert, Linda, and 12 other homeowners who had joined our coalition, a strategic show of support. At precisely 7:00 p.m., Patricia called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of her gavel. This emergency session has been called to address a serious safety concern, she began, her voice carrying a practiced authority. Unauthorized hunting zone signs have been illegally placed throughout our community trails, creating panic among residents and endangering our families. She gestured to the HOA attorney. We have already initiated legal proceedings to have these removed and to hold responsible parties accountable for this reckless action. When she finally acknowledged my raised hand, I approached the podium calmly, placing my documents on the surface before me. Sarah moved to stand slightly behind me, a subtle but clear signal of legal representation. "Good evening," I began. "I appreciate the opportunity to address the community directly. The hunting zone designations are not unauthorized. They are, in fact, legally established wildlife management areas based on historical land usage rights that predate the formation of this HOA. I activated the projector, displaying the first historical document. This is the original land grant from 1892, which explicitly protects hunting rights on these trails in perpetuity. These rights were never properly transferred or nullified when the development was built. Slide by slide, I presented the evidence. The easement agreements, the county wildlife management approval, the conservation plan endorsed by state officials, and the safety protocols that exceeded minimum requirements. These hunting zones are not only legal, I continued, my voice steady and clear. They are actually mandated by the original land grant and supported by current conservation requirements. The deer overpopulation has led to garden destruction, increased tick-borne diseases, and most seriously, a 40% increase in vehicle collisions over the past 3 years. The room had grown completely silent. Even Patricia seemed momentarily stunned by the comprehensive presentation. When she tried to interrupt, another board member raised his hand. "I think we need to hear this out," he said firmly. Patricia's lips tightened, but she nodded stiffly. I continued by addressing the safety concerns directly. This program includes strict safety protocols that exceed state requirements. Hunting will occur only during designated seasons, with advance notice to all residents, and with safety perimeters that are 50% larger than required by law. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. I clicked to the next slide, showing clear video footage of Patricia Henderson attempting to tear down one of the wildlife management signs. Unfortunately, someone has been illegally tampering with officially posted wildlife management notices, which is a violation of state law under Code 42.315. The footage played silently on the screen as Patricia's face flushed deep red. Sarah Harrington stepped forward. "As legal counsel, I must inform the board that interfering with legally established wildlife management areas creates significant liability for the HOA. Additionally, we have filed a formal request for all HOA financial records for the past 5 years as part of our investigation into potential misappropriation of funds from accumulated resident fines." The HOA attorney leaned forward, whispering urgently to Patricia, whose expression shifted from anger to something approaching fear. The other board members exchanged concerned glances. "Furthermore," Sarah continued, "we have filed notice with the county recorder regarding the historical easements and their protected usage rights. Any HOA rules that contradict these established rights are unenforceable under state law." The meeting descended into chaos. Residents began asking questions all at once. The HOA attorney pulled the board members into a corner for an emergency consultation. I returned to my seat, feeling the supportive pats on my shoulder from coalition members. After 15 minutes of heated private discussion, The board returned to their table. The attorney looked grim as he whispered one final thing to Patricia, who nodded stiffly before addressing the room. "This meeting is adjourned pending legal review of the presented materials," she announced, her voice noticeably less confident. "The board will issue a formal response within 7 days." As residents filed out, many stopped to ask me questions or express support. Through the crowd, I could see Patricia sitting alone at the board table, frantically texting on her phone, her carefully constructed authority visibly crumbling around her. The afternoon sun filtered through autumn leaves, casting golden patterns on the forest floor. I walked slowly along the trail, leading a small group of 6 licensed hunters. Each wore bright orange safety vests and carried the required permits in waterproof holders. 50 yards ahead, orange markers designated the active hunting zone, visible from all approach angles. 3 months had passed since that confrontational HOA meeting. The transformation in our community had been remarkable. The initial legal review ordered by the HOA board had confirmed everything Sarah and I had presented. Faced with incontrovertible evidence and the threat of personal liability, the board had voted 4-1 to rescind all previous fines against me. Only Patricia had voted against. The official apology letter now hung framed on my wall beside the county conservation award our newly formed Community Wildlife Management Committee had received last month. The deer population control program had been officially endorsed by state wildlife officials as a model for other communities facing similar challenges. Patricia Henderson had resigned from the HOA board 2 weeks after the emergency meeting. The financial audit Sarah had requested revealed several irregularities in how fine money had been allocated. Nothing overtly illegal, but enough questionable decisions to prompt Patricia to list her house for sale rather than face the community scrutiny. She moved out last week, barely acknowledging her neighbors as she departed. The new HOA board, which now included Robert Jenkins, had adopted reasonable guidelines that respected both safety concerns and property rights. Our committee worked closely with them to ensure transparent communication about hunting schedules and conservation goals. Today marked the first official community-supported hunt. The deer harvested would provide meat for the local food bank and help reduce vehicle collisions that had plagued our roads. Every aspect of the program had been carefully explained to residents through community meetings and newsletters. Many who had initially expressed concerns became supporters after understanding the conservation benefits and safety protocols. "Perfect spot," I said, stopping in a small clearing. The hunters nodded and began setting up according to our carefully developed safety plan. Each had completed additional training beyond state requirements, another element of our model program. Later that evening, our community gathered at the newly renamed Conservation Center for a barbecue. Children played on the freshly installed playground equipment, funded by proper allocation of HOA dues rather than excessive fines. Neighbors who had once viewed each other with suspicion now chatted comfortably, united by their shared experience of positive change. As the sun set behind the trees, casting long shadows across our gathering, I found myself reflecting on the journey. This had never been just about hunting rights. It had been about standing up to unjust authority, about knowing your rights and having the courage to defend them. It had been about transforming conflict into community. Sometimes, I realized, the most satisfying victories come not from defeating enemies, but from restoring balance and building something better in the process. The hunting trails were now serving their historical purpose. The deer population was being responsibly managed, and our community had found a new sense of cooperation and respect. The empty, for sale sign still stood in front of Patricia's former house, a quiet reminder that knowledge, preparation, and determination can overcome even the most entrenched power. As I raised my glass in a toast to our community's future, I could not help but smile at how completely the tables had turned.